SpaceX intends to start launching next-generation Starlink satellites in March. In a new Q&A with the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, SpaceX says it still plans and intends to begin launching the next generation of Starlink satellites as early as March 2022. But before we start, we want to welcome you to the world of Tesla. If you are interested in topics like Tesla, SpaceX, or Elon Musk, you're at the right place, so keep watching the video and don't forget to land your finger on the subscribe button and press the bell icon so that you will be notified each time we have some new content for you. Space Exploration Technologies Corp, SpaceX, is an American aerospace manufacturer, space transportation service, and communications corporation headquartered in Hawthorne, California. SpaceX was founded in 2002 by Elon Musk with the goal of reducing space transportation costs to enable colonization of Mars. SpaceX manufactures the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launch vehicles, several rocket engines, Dragon cargo, cruise spacecraft, and Starlink communication satellites. SpaceX's achievements include the first privately funded liquid-propellant rocket to reach orbit, the first private company to successfully launch orbit and recover a spacecraft, the first private company to send a spacecraft to the International Space Station, the first vertical takeoff and vertical propulsive landing for an orbital rocket, the first reuse of an orbital rocket, and the first private company to send astronauts to orbit and to the International Space Station, the ISS. SpaceX has flown the Falcon 9 series of rockets over 100 times. SpaceX is developing a satellite mega constellation named Starlink to provide commercial internet service. In January 2020, the Starlink constellation became the largest satellite constellation ever launched. But now, the big news. In August 2021, SpaceX filed an application modification request with the FCC in a bid to change its plans for the next generation Gen 2 Starlink constellation, which still aims to drastically improve and expand upon its first few phases. SpaceX filed the first unmodified Gen 2 Starlink application with the FCC in May of 2020, requesting permission to launch an unprecedented 30,000 satellites. While the size of the proposed constellation is extraordinary, the FCC has also been exceptionally slow to process it. Only 5 months after SpaceX submitted its Starlink Gen 2 modification request, and 19 months after its original Gen 2 application, did the FCC finally accept it for filing, which means that it's taken more than a year and a half to merely start the official review process. As you can imagine, this extremely slow pace of work could cause problems for SpaceX's characteristically ambitious deployment schedule. In a January 7, 2022 electric filing in which SpaceX answered a dozen questions from the FCC, the company didn't outright criticize the extreme sluggishness with which it was reviewing the application, but the sentiment was still just below the surface through it all. After noting that the FCC continues to ask for far more information from SpaceX than it does from other constellation applications, some of which have recently received licenses in spite of that, while it filed its Gen 2 application more than 19 months ago and its amendment nearly 5 months ago, they were accepted for filing only 2 weeks ago. It's perhaps no coincidence that that inexplicable delay only came to an end 2 weeks after FCC chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel, who SpaceX notes recently acknowledged a need to speed the processing of applications to keep pace with innovation, was finally confirmed by the US Senate. Most importantly though, SpaceX used its extensive Q&A to reveal it down-selected to one of the 2 similar constellation configurations proposed in its Gen 2 application modification. Specifically, SpaceX says it will continue to develop Configuration 1 only, which is designed and organized to take full advantage of the company's next-generation Starship launch vehicle. That should simplify the licensing process for many Starlink competitors, which have sought to hobble SpaceX's application with bizarre requests to the FCC and complained ad nauseum about how much of a burden analyzing two potentially constellation layouts was for them. Now, they will only have to consider one constellation layout, making SpaceX's Gen 2 constellation a more traditional proposal. Although SpaceX had to wait 19 months, it has already prepared its staff in August 2021 to launch the Starlink Gen 2 satellite in March 2022. At this time, the satellites are still scheduled to launch in March of this year. Many readers and industry followers interpret this as an implicit claim that Starship will be ready to launch Starlink Gen 2 satellites as early as March 2022. While SpaceX does confirm that it's settling on a Starlink Gen 2 configuration that will explicitly depend upon Starship for the full 29,988 satellite constellations, timely, cost-effective deployment, FCC deployment and operations licensing are almost inherently unconcerned with how the constellation gets into space. For example, the original Gen 2 application SpaceX modified last August never mentioned which launch vehicle would be responsible for launching tens of thousands of satellites. So long as the rocket is compliant with FCC regulations and has an active permit for any given launch, which is also the responsibility of a different bureau, the FCC is effectively indifferent about which rockets launch a given constellation. In other words, while SpaceX has made it clear that Starlink Gen 2 Configuration 1 is optimized for Starship, SpaceX will be free to launch Gen 2 satellites on any rocket it wants if or when the FCC approves the constellation. This is to say that there's nothing theoretically preventing SpaceX from again pursuing permission to launch a few prototype Starlink satellites before the FCC has finished reviewing and approving the whole constellation. In fact, anything less would actually be surprising and unusual for the company. When SpaceX says in January 2022 that it plans to have Gen 2 satellites ready for launch by March 2022, it's thus not hard to believe that that's the truth. Perhaps it will take a month or two longer than planned to complete the prototypes, secure temporary FCC approval, and build and license a new E-band ground station, but it's still believable that SpaceX will be ready and able to launch the first few Starlink Gen 2 satellites on Falcon 9 within the next several months. Above all else, unless SpaceX has explicitly designed Starlink Gen 2 satellites such that they no longer fit inside a Falcon fairing, nothing is forcing SpaceX to wait for Starship if Gen 2 prototypes are ready to launch before the next gen rocket. Before we know if any of this is really going to happen, we will have to wait and see. Fortunately, the satellites are scheduled to take to the air in March of this year. Luckily, that's only about 2 months away. We have already come to the end of this spectacular video. Do you like content about Tesla, SpaceX, and Elon Musk? Then make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for more.